Margaret Chen adjusted her worn leather jacket as she walked through the bustling hallway of the Veterans Affairs building. At 68, her steps were slower than they once were, but her spine remained straight. The morning sun streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. She had come here for a simple reason. The government was finally reviewing cases of veterans who had been denied benefits. After 43 years of silence, Margaret thought it might be time to try again. The waiting room buzzed with conversation. Veterans from different wars sat in plastic chairs, sharing stories and complaints. Margaret found an empty seat near the corner and pulled out a small notebook. She always carried it with her, though she rarely wrote in it anymore. "Next," called a voice from behind the service counter. Margaret looked up to see a young woman with short blonde hair and a crisp uniform. The nameplate on her desk read, "Sarah Mitchell, Claims Specialist." "I'm here about a benefits review," Margaret said quietly, approaching the counter. Sarah looked at her computer screen, then back at Margaret. "Name and service dates, please." Margaret Chen. Service from 1969 to 1971. Sarah's fingers flew across the keyboard. Her eyebrows raised slightly. "I'm not seeing any record of overseas deployment for women during that period in your file. Are you sure about those dates?" Margaret had heard this question hundreds of times. "Yes, I'm sure. Ma'am, with respect, women weren't in combat roles during Vietnam. They served as nurses and support staff, mostly stateside." The conversation at nearby tables began to quiet. Other veterans turned to listen. Margaret felt the familiar weight in her chest, the same feeling she'd carried for decades. "I wasn't officially there," Margaret said, her voice steady. Sarah looked confused. "I'm sorry, what do you mean by not officially?" An older man at a nearby table chuckled. "Lady, if you weren't officially there, then you weren't there. That's how the military works." Margaret turned to face him. His baseball cap bore the insignia of the 101st Airborne. Medals and patches covered his jacket, like armor. "Women didn't fight in Nam," he continued, louder now. "They stayed safe while real soldiers did the dirty work." More heads turned. The room grew quieter. "Is that what you think?" Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not what I think, lady. It's what happened. Women weren't in the jungle. They weren't in the firefights. They sure weren't with the special ops boys." Margaret felt something shift inside her chest. After 43 years of keeping quiet, of being told her service didn't count, of watching benefits get denied while she struggled to make ends meet, something finally snapped. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small, worn piece of metal. It was about the size of a silver dollar, tarnished with age. In the center was the image of a lion, surrounded by words in a language most people wouldn't recognize. She set it gently on Sarah's counter. "Golden lion," she whispered. The effect was immediate. Sarah's face went white. The veteran with the 101st Airborne cap stopped talking mid-sentence. A man near the back of the room who had been reading a newspaper slowly lowered it. "Where did you get that?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking slightly. Margaret didn't answer immediately. She looked around the room at the faces staring back at her. Some showed confusion. Others showed something that might have been recognition. Or fear. "I earned it," she said finally. The man with the 101st cap stood up slowly. "That's impossible." "Is it?" Margaret asked. Sarah picked up the medallion with trembling hands. She examined it closely, turning it over. On the back was a series of numbers and a single word. "Classified." "I need to make a phone call," Sarah said, standing abruptly. She disappeared into a back office, taking the medallion with her. The waiting room was completely silent now. Margaret could hear the air conditioning humming overhead and the distant sound of traffic outside. "What unit?" asked a voice from the back of the room. Margaret turned to see an elderly black man with gray hair and knowing eyes. Unlike the others, he didn't look confused. He looked like he'd been waiting for this conversation for a very long time. "You know better than to ask that question, soldier," Margaret replied. The man nodded slowly. "Yes, ma'am. I suppose I do." Minutes passed like hours. Margaret remained standing at the counter, aware that every eye in the room was on her. She thought about the young woman she had been in 1969, fresh out of college with a degree in languages and a burning desire to serve her country. She remembered the recruiter who had approached her on campus. He wasn't wearing a uniform. He had simply introduced himself as someone who worked for the government and needed people with her particular skills. "We can't officially recruit you," he had explained over coffee in a small cafe. "Women can't serve in combat roles. But there are other ways to serve. Other ways that matter just as much, maybe more." She had been 19 and naive enough to believe that her service would be recognized someday. That the promises made in that little cafe would be kept. The door to the back office opened, and Sarah returned. Her face was pale, and she moved like someone who had just received shocking news. "Ma'am," she said, setting the medallion back on the counter, "I've been instructed to expedite your claim review. Someone will be in contact with you within 48 hours. "That's it?" asked the man with the 101st cap. "She shows you some old coin and suddenly she gets special treatment?" Sarah looked at him with an expression that was hard to read. "Sir, I think you should sit down." "Like hell I will. I want to know what's so special about that piece of metal." Margaret picked up the medallion and slipped it back into her pocket. "You want to know what's special about it? It means I was places you've never heard of, doing things your clearance level couldn't access, with people whose names aren't in any official record." "Bullshit," the veteran said. But his voice lacked conviction now. "You think women weren't in Vietnam because you didn't see them in your unit. You think women weren't in combat because they weren't carrying rifles next to you in the bush. You're right about all of that." Margaret walked closer to him, her voice growing stronger. "But you're wrong if you think that meant we weren't there. You're wrong if you think we weren't fighting. And you're wrong if you think our wars were any less real than yours." She paused, looking around the room at faces that were no longer skeptical, but confused and a little frightened. "Some of us fought in wars that officially never happened. In places that don't exist on any map you've ever seen. Against enemies whose names you'll never learn." The elderly black man in the back nodded slightly. Margaret caught his eye and saw understanding there. "The Golden Lion," she continued, "isn't just a medallion. It's proof that some secrets are bigger than the people who keep them. And sometimes, just sometimes, those secrets finally come to light." Sarah cleared her throat. "Ma'am, is there anything else I can help you with today?" Margaret looked at the young woman behind the counter. She seemed genuinely shaken by whatever conversation she had just had on the phone. "Just make sure my file gets the attention it deserves," Margaret said. "I've been waiting 43 years. I'd like to see some progress before I turn 70. As she turned to leave, the veteran with the 101st cap called out to her. "Wait. What unit were you really with?" Margaret paused at the door. "The kind that doesn't have a unit designation." "Soldier. The kind that operates in the spaces between what's official and what's necessary." She pushed through the glass doors and walked out into the bright morning sunshine. Behind her, the waiting room erupted in confused conversation as veterans tried to make sense of what they had just witnessed. Margaret walked to her old Honda Civic and sat behind the wheel for a moment. She pulled out the medallion again and ran her thumb across its worn surface. The lion's eyes seemed to stare back at her, holding memories of jungles and operations and people who had trusted her with their lives. For the first time in decades, she allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, her service would finally be acknowledged. Not just by the government that had spent 40 years pretending she didn't exist, but by the fellow veterans who had dismissed her experiences. She started the car and drove home, unaware that her simple act of showing a small piece of metal would set in motion events that would shake the foundations of what people thought they knew about the Vietnam War. In the waiting room she had left behind, phones were already ringing, questions were being asked, and somewhere in the halls of power, people who had spent decades keeping certain secrets were about to have a very bad day. 3 days after Margaret Chen walked out of the Veterans Affairs building, her phone rang at 6 in the morning. "Miss Chen, this is Colonel Rebecca Martinez from the Department of Defense. I need to meet with you today." Margaret had been awake since 5, as was her habit. She sat in her small kitchen, drinking coffee and watching the sunrise through her window. "What about?" she asked. "I think you know what about, ma'am. Can you be at the Marriott downtown at 2 p.m.? Conference Room B." Conference Room B. Margaret almost smiled. After decades of being ignored, suddenly everyone wanted to talk. "I'll be there." The Marriott was busier than she expected for a Tuesday afternoon. Margaret found Conference Room B and knocked twice before entering. The room held 3 people. Colonel Martinez was a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and perfect posture. Beside her sat a man in a civilian suit, who introduced himself as David Park from the State Department. The third person was someone Margaret recognized immediately, though it took her a moment to place him. "Hello, Chen," said the elderly black man from the VA waiting room. "Told you I'd been waiting for this conversation for a long time." "Sergeant Major Washington," Margaret said, extending her hand. "It's been a while." 43 years, give or take," he replied with a slight smile. Colonel Martinez gestured for Margaret to sit. "Miss Chen, what you did at the VA has created some complications. I showed them proof of my service." "How is that a complication?" David Park leaned forward. "Because that proof relates to operations that are still classified at the highest levels. Operations that officially never happened." Margaret looked at each of them in turn. "Are you here to threaten me?" "Because I'm 68 years old, and I've kept my mouth shut for over 4 decades. I think I've earned the right to claim my benefits." "We're here," said Sergeant Major Washington, "because it's time for the truth." He opened a thick folder and slid several photographs across the table. The images were black and white, clearly old, and showed what appeared to be a small military compound in dense jungle. "Firebase Golden Lion," Washington said. "Officially, it never existed. Unofficially, it was one of the most important intelligence operations of the Vietnam War." Margaret picked up one of the photographs. It showed a young Asian woman in military fatigues, standing next to a radio operator. Her hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and she was smiling despite the obvious stress in her eyes. "I was 22, Margaret said quietly. "You were recruited because you spoke fluent Vietnamese, Mandarin, and Cantonese," Colonel Martinez continued. "Your official records show you were a translator at a base in Thailand. But that was your cover. The real Margaret Chen," added David Park, "spent 2 years coordinating intelligence operations between American forces and local resistance fighters in areas that were supposed to be completely controlled by the North Vietnamese." Margaret set down the photograph. "Why are you telling me this now? Why not just keep denying everything like you have for 40 years? Washington smiled grimly. "Because times have changed. The War Powers Act requires certain disclosures. More importantly, some of our former enemies are talking. The Vietnamese government is releasing documents about the war. If they mention Firebase Golden Lion, we need to be ahead of the story. So this is about damage control, partly," admitted Colonel Martinez. "But it's also about recognition. People like you and Sergeant Major Washington did work that saved American lives. Work that helped end the war sooner than it might have otherwise ended. You deserve credit for that." Margaret looked at Washington. "What was your role?" "Communications liaison. I coordinated between Golden Lion and Command. I was one of the few people who knew what you were really doing out there." He pulled out another photograph. This one showed Margaret with a group of Vietnamese fighters, all of them armed and serious-looking. "These men," Washington continued, "were part of a network that fed us intelligence about North Vietnamese troop movements, supply routes, and planned attacks. The information they provided led to successful operations that disrupted enemy supply lines and prevented attacks on American bases." "How many people died because of what I did?" Margaret asked quietly. The room fell silent. Finally, David Park answered. "We estimate that intelligence from Golden Lion operations prevented at least 3 major attacks on American installations. Those attacks would have killed hundreds of American soldiers. And how many Vietnamese died because of the information we provided? That's harder to calculate," admitted Colonel Martinez. "But the operations were targeted at military installations and supply routes, not civilian areas." Margaret stood and walked to the window. The city spread out below her, peaceful and ordinary. It was hard to believe that decisions made in conference rooms like this one had once determined who lived and who died in a jungle on the other side of the world. "What do you want from me?" she asked. "We want to offer you a choice," said Washington. "We can process your benefits quietly. Give you what you've earned. Make sure you're taken care of. All you have to do is sign a new non-disclosure agreement and never mention Golden Lion again. Or," Colonel Martinez spoke up, "or you can help us tell the story properly. We're planning to declassify parts of the Golden Lion operation. With your cooperation, we can make sure the story includes recognition for the women who served in roles that weren't officially acknowledged." Margaret turned back to them. "What's the catch?" "The catch," said David Park, "is that once this story goes public, your life changes. Media attention. Questions from historians and journalists. Probably some criticism from people who think certain secrets should stay buried. And possibly danger," added Washington quietly. "What kind of danger?" "Some of the people you worked with in Vietnam are still alive. Some of them have since become important political figures. Some of them have enemies who might see this as an opportunity for revenge." Margaret sat back down and studied their faces. After decades of being dismissed and ignored, suddenly her story mattered to people with power. But she had learned long ago that when powerful people offered you something, they usually wanted something bigger in return. "I need to know something," she said. "The other women. I wasn't the only one." Washington nodded. "There were 7 women in the Golden Lion program over its 2-year operation. 3 were translators like you. 2 were communications specialists. 2 were medics who treated both American personnel and local allies. Where are they now?" 2 died in Vietnam, not in combat, but from disease. 1 died in a car accident in 1985. 2 others died of natural causes over the years. That leaves you and 1 other. "Who?" Colonel Martinez consulted her notes. "Maria Santos. She lives in Arizona now. Retired teacher. She's already agreed to participate in the declassification." Margaret felt a surge of emotion she hadn't expected. "Maria's alive?" "Very much so. She's been fighting for recognition almost as long as you have." The room fell quiet again. Margaret closed her eyes and thought about the woman she had been at 22. Brave, idealistic, convinced that she was serving a cause bigger than herself. She thought about the Vietnamese fighters who had trusted her with their lives, and the American soldiers whose names she would never know who had lived because of the intelligence her team had gathered. "The benefits," she said finally. "How much are we talking about?" David Park slid a document across the table. "Full disability compensation retroactive to 1,971. Medical coverage. Educational benefits for your grandchildren. The total package is worth about $1.2 million. Margaret whistled softly. "That's a lot of money." "It's what you earned," said Washington. "With interest." She picked up the photograph of herself at 22 and studied it for a long moment. The young woman in the picture looked confident and determined. She looked like someone who believed her service would be recognized and valued. "If I do this," Margaret said, "if I agree to help you tell this story, I want something else." "What?" asked Colonel Martinez. "I want the names of every woman who served in the Golden Lion program released. All 7 of them. I want their families to know what they did. I want their service recognized. Even the ones who died in Vietnam? Especially the ones who died in Vietnam." The 3 officials exchanged glances. David Park made a note in his file. "We can arrange that," he said. Margaret stood up. "Then I'll do it. But I want to talk to Maria first. I want to make sure we're telling the same story." Colonel Martinez smiled for the first time since the meeting began. "Miss Chen, I think you're going to find that Maria Santos has been waiting to tell this story for a very long time." As Margaret left the conference room, she felt something she hadn't experienced in decades. Purpose. For 43 years, her service had been a secret she carried alone. Now, finally, it would become part of the historical record. But she also felt something else. A nagging worry that the powerful people who had just offered her money and recognition might have motives she didn't fully understand. In the hallway, she passed a man in a suit who nodded politely as she walked by. She thought nothing of it at the time. It would be several days before she realized that the same man had been following her since she left the Veterans Affairs building. Some secrets, Margaret was about to learn, were more dangerous than others. Maria Santos lived in a small house on the outskirts of Phoenix, surrounded by desert and memories. When Margaret called her, Maria cried for 10 minutes before she could speak. "I knew this day would come," Maria said through her tears. "I just didn't think I'd live to see it. I didn't think I'd live to see it." They arranged to meet in person. Margaret flew to Phoenix the following week, and the two women sat on Maria's back porch, watching the sunset paint the desert mountains purple and gold. "Do you ever regret it?" Maria asked, "keeping quiet for so long?" Margaret considered the question carefully. "I regret that the men who died never got credit for what they did. I regret that families never knew why their sons and husbands were really in those jungles. But keeping quiet? No. We gave our word." Maria nodded. "Even when they denied our benefits. Even when they treated us like we were making it all up. Even then." They talked through the night, sharing stories that had been locked away for decades. Margaret learned that Maria had been at Firebase Golden Lion for 6 months. Arriving just as Margaret was preparing to leave, they had overlapped for only 2 weeks. But Maria remembered her clearly. "You were a legend among the local fighters," Maria said. "They called you the woman who speaks truth. They trusted you more than they trusted most of the American men." "The feeling was mutual," Margaret replied, as the desert dawn broke around them. Both women felt something they hadn't experienced in years. They felt heard. For the first time since Vietnam, they were talking to someone who truly understood what they had been through. But their reunion was interrupted by a phone call. Margaret's phone rang at 7 a.m. The caller ID showed David Park's number. "Miss Chen, we have a problem." His voice was tense. "What kind of problem?" "Someone leaked information about the Golden Lion declassification. It's going to be front-page news tomorrow morning." Margaret felt her stomach drop. "How is that possible? We just had our meeting 3 days ago. We're investigating that. Right now, I need both of you somewhere safe, until we can assess the situation." Within 2 hours, Margaret and Maria found themselves in a nondescript hotel room in downtown Phoenix, with 2 federal marshals stationed outside their door. The newspaper article, when they finally saw it, was devastating. "Secret war program used women as expendable assets." Read the headline of the Washington Herald. The story, written by investigative journalist Amanda Walsh, detailed how the military had secretly recruited women for dangerous intelligence operations, while publicly maintaining that women weren't in combat roles. But the article got several key facts wrong. It claimed that the women had been sent into combat situations without proper training. It suggested that the military had deliberately concealed casualties among female personnel. Most damaging of all, it quoted an unnamed source, saying that the Golden Lion program had been an experiment to see how expendable women soldiers could be. "This is garbage," Maria said, throwing the newspaper across the room. "We weren't expendable. We were specialists. We volunteered for everything we did." Margaret was reading the article more carefully. Amanda Walsh. I recognize that name. She's been investigating military cover-ups for years. Someone fed her this story specifically to discredit the declassification. David Park arrived at their hotel room an hour later, looking like he hadn't slept. "The leak came from inside the Pentagon," he said without preamble. "Someone with high-level access provided Walsh with documents, but they also provided her with false information designed to make the Golden Lion program look like a criminal conspiracy." "Who?" asked Margaret. "We're still investigating. But we think it's someone who doesn't want certain aspects of the program to become public." Maria stood up and began pacing. "What aspects? We've told you everything. What could be so damaging that someone would sabotage the whole declassification?" Park hesitated. "There's something we haven't told you. Something that wasn't in your operational files because it was handled through separate channels." Margaret felt a chill. "What?" "The intelligence you gathered at Golden Lion wasn't just used for tactical operations. Some of it was passed to South Vietnamese political figures who used it to eliminate North Vietnamese sympathizers in areas under South Vietnamese control. The room went silent. "Are you telling us," Margaret said slowly, "that the information we provided was used for political assassinations?" "Not directly. The intelligence was accurate and legitimate, but how it was used by our allies wasn't always under our control." Maria sat down heavily. "How many people?" "We don't know exactly. The estimates range from dozens to hundreds over the 2-year period." Margaret felt sick. "And you didn't think we deserved to know this?" "The decision was made at the highest levels that personnel involved in intelligence gathering shouldn't be burdened with knowledge of how that intelligence was ultimately used." "Burdened?" Maria's voice was rising. "We had a right to know." David Park looked genuinely uncomfortable. "You're right. You did. But the reality is that if this information becomes public now, it will overshadow everything else about the Golden Lion program. The media will focus on the assassinations and ignore the lives you saved, the legitimate military operations you supported." Margaret walked to the window and looked out at the busy Phoenix Street below. Normal people going about their normal lives, unaware that 2 women in a hotel room above them were grappling with the moral weight of actions taken 50 years ago. "Who leaked this story?" she asked. "We think it's General Harrison Wolfe. He was a colonel during Vietnam, involved in the liaison between Golden Lion and South Vietnamese intelligence." "Why would he want to stop the declassification?" "Because he's the one who authorized passing the intelligence to the South Vietnamese. If the full story comes out, including the assassinations, his role will be scrutinized. He could face war crimes charges." Maria joined Margaret at the window. "So he'd rather destroy our reputations than face the consequences of his own decisions." "That appears to be the case." Margaret turned back to David Park. "What are our options?" "We can proceed with the declassification as planned, but with the understanding that it will now be overshadowed by controversy. We can provide you with full security and legal protection, but you'll likely face intense media scrutiny and possibly hostile questioning about your role in the assassinations. Or, we can cancel the declassification. Process your benefits quietly, as originally offered. The leak will be discredited as coming from unreliable sources, and the story will fade away." Margaret and Maria looked at each other. They had waited decades for recognition of their service. But was it worth becoming the face of a program that had apparently been used for purposes they had never intended? "I need to know something," Margaret said. "The Vietnamese fighters we worked with, the ones who trusted us, what happened to them after the war?" Park consulted his notes. "Many were evacuated to the United States. Some were captured or killed when Saigon fell. A few became boat people and eventually made it to refugee camps. Are any of them still alive?" "Several. We've been in contact with some of them as part of the declassification process." "What do they say about what we did?" "They say you saved their lives. They say the intelligence operations disrupted North Vietnamese plans and gave them a chance to survive until the evacuation." Maria spoke quietly. "And the people who died because of our information? According to our Vietnamese contacts, they were mostly North Vietnamese intelligence officers and sympathizers who were already known to South Vietnamese security forces. The information you provided may have accelerated their capture, but many of them were already under investigation." Margaret felt the weight of 43 years pressing down on her shoulders. She thought about the young woman she had been, eager to serve her country and convinced that her actions were unambiguously good. She thought about the complexity of war and the impossible moral choices that young people were asked to make. "If we go forward with this," she said finally, "if we tell our story despite the controversy, will the truth come out? The whole truth, including both the good and the bad?" "I believe so, yes." Maria took a deep breath. "Margaret, I've spent 40 years keeping quiet about what we did. I've spent 40 years being proud of our service but unable to tell anyone about it. I don't want to spend my remaining years hiding from the truth." Margaret nodded slowly. "General Wolfe made his choices 50 years ago. We made ours. His choices were about power and politics. Ours were about serving our country and protecting the people who trusted us." She turned to David Park. "We'll go forward with the declassification. We'll tell our story. The whole story." But we want full disclosure about how our intelligence was used. If we're going to be held accountable for the consequences of our actions, then everyone else should be held accountable for theirs." Park smiled for the first time since entering the room. "Miss Chen, I think that's exactly the right approach." 6 months later, Margaret and Maria stood together at a podium in the Pentagon, facing a room full of journalists and cameras. They wore their dress uniforms for the first time in 50 years, both bearing decorations that had been classified until that morning. They told their story simply and honestly. They described their training, their deployment, their work with Vietnamese allies, and their pride in their service. They also acknowledged the complexity of war and the difficult moral questions raised by intelligence operations. The questions from reporters were tough, sometimes hostile. But Margaret and Maria had prepared for this moment for months. They answered every question directly, without defensiveness or apology. When it was over, they walked together down the Pentagon corridors, where 50 years earlier, young officers had made decisions that would echo through decades. "Do you think we did the right thing?" Maria asked. Margaret considered the question. "I think we told the truth. After 43 years of silence, I think we owed that to the women who served with us, to the people who trusted us in Vietnam, and to ourselves." Outside, protesters held signs both supporting and condemning the Golden Lion program. Inside, historians were already beginning the work of incorporating this newly declassified chapter into the official record of the Vietnam War. Margaret looked at her reflection in the polished Pentagon walls. She was no longer the 22-year-old woman who had walked into a jungle with nothing but her language skills and her determination to serve. She was 68, gray-haired, and tired. But she was also, finally, recognized. The Golden Lion was no longer a secret, and Margaret Chen was no longer invisible. 3 weeks later, General Harrison Wolfe was arrested on charges related to war crimes committed during his service in Vietnam. His attempt to discredit the Golden Lion declassification had backfired, leading to increased scrutiny of his own actions during the war. Margaret read about his arrest in her local newspaper while drinking her morning coffee. She felt no satisfaction in his downfall, only a deep sadness that the war they had fought so long ago was still claiming victims. She picked up her phone and called Maria. "Did you see the news?" she asked. "Yes," Maria replied. "I feel sorry for him, actually." "Why?" "Because he spent 50 years trying to bury the truth instead of facing it. That's no way to live." Margaret looked out her kitchen window at the sunrise, the same view she had watched every morning for years. But somehow, it looked different now. Brighter, perhaps. Or maybe she was just seeing it with different eyes. "Maria," she said, "what do you want to do with the rest of our time?" "I want to tell more stories," Maria replied without hesitation. "I want to make sure that everyone who served gets the recognition they deserve, not just us." Margaret smiled. "I think that sounds like a perfect mission." And so, at 68 and 71 respectively, Margaret Chen and Maria Santos began their final tour of duty. Not in the jungles of Vietnam, but in the conference rooms and classrooms of America, ensuring that no veteran service would ever again be dismissed or forgotten. The Golden Lion had finally roared.